She was just the invisible night nurse, until one whisper during a surgery changed everything. He was the hospital's coldest, most brilliant surgeon, but the woman he never saw just saved his life. Watch until the end, because this is not just a love story. It's a story of redemption, courage, and the quiet power of being seen. Before we continue, we ask you to support our channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your participation is essential for us to keep bringing you captivating stories like this one. The air inside St. Jude's Royal Infirmary on a relentlessly damp and dreary Tuesday morning in London was a separate entity. It was a sterile, complex symphony of antiseptic, the metallic tang of fear, and the almost imperceptible scent of hope that stubbornly insisted on blooming in the most desolate and clinical of places. It was in this environment, where life and death waged their daily, silent wars under the cold, impersonal glare of fluorescent lights, that nurse Ilara Vance moved like a silent, efficient ghost, an anonymous guardian angel in a universe of controlled chaos and raw pain. At 27, Ilara was the very embodiment of dedication and self-sacrifice. She lived in a small, cramped flat in Lewisham, a space that barely contained herself and her mother, a gentle, frail woman, confined to a hospital bed in the living room by a cruel, degenerative illness. Her mother's care, the specialized equipment, and the expensive medications consumed the vast majority of Ilara's salary and energy. To make ends meet, Ilara worked punishing double shifts, eagerly taking the grueling night rotations that her younger colleagues, with their vibrant social lives and weekend plans, so desperately avoided. She did so without a word of complaint, always with a serenity that bordered on resignation. Her National Health Service uniform, though impeccably clean, was faded from years of intense use, its blue fabric worn thin at the elbows. Her practical, comfortable Clark shoes, the only pair she owned, bore the silent witness of countless miles walked along the labyrinthine corridors of the historic hospital. Yet, the exhaustion that settled on her shoulders and the worry that etched fine lines around her eyes could never extinguish the soft, genuine smile she offered to every patient. That smile was often the only sliver of sunlight in the long, dark night of a suffering soul. Despite her undeniable competence and unwavering dedication, Ilara Vance was an almost invisible figure to the majority of her colleagues and superiors. Her introverted nature, her quiet refusal to engage in the gossip and cliques that formed in the staff rooms, and her tendency to focus with an obsessive intensity on her work kept her in a kind of social limbo. The doctors, striding past with their air of importance, would give her a hurried, dismissive nod. The other nurses rarely invited her for a coffee or a pint after a long shift. She was the functional piece, the silent cog that ensured the great machine of the hospital ran smoothly, but whose individual existence was frequently overlooked. "What's the name of the night nurse in the cardiac wing?" a bleary-eyed junior doctor might ask another. "Eleanor? Or is it Helen?" the colleague would reply with an indifferent shrug. "Dunno, mate. The quiet one, the one who never says much." And so, she was defined by her absence of noise, by her stillness in a world that so highly valued self-promotion and volume. Her value was immense but anonymous, a quiet force that sustained the chaos without ever asking for anything in return. She had grown accustomed to this invisibility, embracing it like a protective cloak that allowed her to observe the world without being observed, to care without being disturbed. However, if to the hospital staff she was merely the quiet one, to the patients, especially the most fragile and forgotten, Ilara was a luminous presence, a balm for their afflicted souls. They were the ones who noticed the small gestures of kindness that went unseen by everyone else. They saw the way she brought, on her own initiative, a flask of warm, homemade broth for the elderly patients who received no visitors, sitting by their bedsides, and patiently listening to their repetitive stories of a long-faded past. They heard her soft voice, humming an old English lullaby to a child undergoing chemotherapy, whose exhausted mother had finally drifted off to sleep in a chair in the corner of the room. They felt the gentle, respectful touch of her hands as she adjusted a pillow, checked a temperature, or offered a glass of water in the dead of night, a touch that seemed to heal more than many medications. Ilara had a special gift for connecting with those whom the hospital, with its cold logic and impersonal protocols, had often already forgotten. Those who were seen more as a bed number and a medical record than as suffering human beings. And it was in this silent care, this anonymous giving, that she found the true purpose of her profession and the only real reward for her life of sacrifice. Each grateful smile from a patient was, to her, more valuable than any formal recognition from her superiors. At the opposite end of this same hospital universe, inhabiting the Olympus of the medical hierarchy, was Dr. Julian Croft. At 38, he was the head of the cardiothoracic surgery department, a surgeon of a technical brilliance that bordered on genius, and a temperament that bordered on the unbearable. He was a man of impeccable elegance and a classical, intimidating beauty, always with a vintage Omega watch of exorbitant value on his wrist, a bespoke Savile Row suit hidden beneath his pristine white coat, and an air of superiority that seemed to create an invisible force field around him. Julian Croft never smiled. He never offered thanks, and he rarely bothered to learn the names of the registrars or surgical techs who assisted him in the operating theater. To him, people were defined by their function and their competence, and anything short of absolute perfection was treated with a cutting disdain or an icy indifference. He was the personification of professional excellence and emotional bankruptcy, a man who seemed to have ice water running through his veins. His heart, according to the whispers in the corridors, had been replaced by a precision mechanism as functional and as devoid of warmth as the instruments he wielded with such mastery. There was an unwritten rule, a commandment whispered by the senior registrars to the terrified junior doctors, a kind of survival guide for anyone who had to interact with the feared Dr. Croft. Rule 1. Never, ever make direct eye contact, a third-year registrar would advise a petrified newcomer. It's like looking into the sun. You'll get burned. Keep your head down, answer only what he asks, and pray to God you don't make a mistake. Another golden rule was that of punctuality. If you're late for one of his surgeries, even by a minute, prepare to be publicly humiliated. He'll dissect you with words so cold and precise, you'll wish the floor would open up and swallow you whole. Yet, despite the fear he inspired, everyone, without exception, respected him profoundly. They respected his steady, precise hands, which performed surgical feats that seemed like miracles. They respected his brilliant mind, which could diagnose the rarest conditions and find solutions for the most desperate cases. They respected him because, at the end of the day, despite his arrogance and his verbal cruelty, Julian Croft saved lives. And for him, that was the only outcome that mattered. Perfection was his only deity, and he demanded a daily sacrifice to it from himself and from everyone around him, an altar where human emotions had no place. The inevitable collision between these two opposing universes, that of the invisible nurse and the untouchable doctor, occurred on a cold, rain-lashed morning during an emergency heart surgery that should have been routine but had rapidly descended into a nightmare. A middle-aged patient, having undergone a coronary artery bypass graft, suffered a rare post-operative complication and went into sudden cardiac arrest in the intensive care unit. Julian Croft was summoned from his pristine Kensington flat and arrived at the operating theatre in under 20 minutes, already dressed in his surgical scrubs, the expression on his face darker and more focused than ever. The situation was critical. The patient's chest had been reopened, but the team could not identify the source of the massive hemorrhage that was killing him. The blood pressure was plummeting, the monitor's alarms shrieked in a symphony of panic, and the tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a scalpel. The other surgeons, experienced professionals, hesitated, lost, unsure of what to do. It was then that, from the back of the room, from her station as the circulating nurse, Ilara, who had been observing every movement with feverish attention, murmured, her voice so low it was almost drowned out by the sound of the machines. "Doctor, forgive me, but there might be a possibility. If you use direct compression on the left subclavian vein, it might control the bleed. I read a paper on a similar technique in a trauma case from King's College." Ilara's words hung in the air for a moment, a sacrilege in the middle of the chief. Surgeon's high-stakes liturgy. Julian Croft, his eyes fixed on the patient's open thoracic cavity, his face slick with sweat under his surgical cap, did not even deign to look in her direction. He ignored her completely, as if she were just another background noise, a fly buzzing in his ear. The suggestion, coming from a simple nurse in a moment of such crisis, was, to him, an insolence, an unacceptable breach of protocol. He continued his desperate search for the source of the bleed, the patient's blood pressure dropping ever lower, time running out with relentless cruelty. But the minutes ticked by, and the solution did not present itself. Desperation began to seep through the cracks in his armor of control. And then, when all seemed lost, when the line on the electrocardiogram threatened to go flat, he, in an act of pure instinct and a humility he himself would not recognize, remembered the whispered words of the silent nurse. With a swift, precise movement, he did exactly as she had suggested. He applied firm, direct pressure to the left subclavian vein, and like a miracle, the bleeding began to subside. The patient's blood pressure started to stabilize. The alarms on the monitors fell silent. A collective sigh of relief swept through the operating theater. The patient was saved. Everyone breathed again. But in the silent celebration of that victory over death, no one, absolutely no one, mentioned Ilara's name. The credit, as always, went entirely to the genius of Dr. Croft, to his brilliant intuition in the moment of crisis. She remained, as always, invisible. Hours later, long after the adrenaline of the emergency had dissipated and St. Jude's had settled back into its nocturnal rhythm, Dr. Julian Croft could not get the incident out of his mind. In the sterile quiet of his office, surrounded by framed diplomas and anatomical charts, the voice of the quiet nurse echoed, cutting through the usual silence of his thoughts. It wasn't just that her suggestion had been correct. It was the way she had delivered it. There was no panic in her voice, no desperate grasping. It was a statement of fact, offered with a calm certainty that was utterly at odds with the chaos of the room. How could she, a nurse whose duties were to administer drugs and change dressings, possess such specific, esoteric surgical knowledge? Where did that composure come from? The question was an irritant, a logical anomaly in his perfectly ordered world. Curiosity, an emotion he rarely indulged, began to consume him. He needed an answer. He needed to understand the variable he hadn't accounted for. And so, he went looking for her. He found her in the drab, soulless staff room on the 4th floor, a place he hadn't set foot in for years. She was sitting alone at a formica table under a flickering fluorescent light, nursing a lukewarm tea in a paper cup. The exhaustion was evident in the slight slump of her shoulders, but the same unnerving serenity remained in her expression as she stared at the wall. He entered without knocking, his imposing presence immediately shrinking the small room. She looked up, and her eyes widened slightly in surprise at seeing him there, in her world, at this hour. "The maneuver," he began, forgoing any pleasantries. His voice was clipped, direct, the voice he used in the operating theater. "In the CTQ. Where did you learn it?" Ilara met his intense gaze without flinching. She set her cup down slowly, her movements deliberate. "I read about it, Doctor," she answered, her voice even and calm. He took a step closer, his skepticism a palpable force in the room. "You read about it? Where?" "In a medical journal," she replied. "I believe it was The Lancet, a case study on managing catastrophic hemorrhage in thoracic trauma, published by a team at King's College Hospital a few months ago." The specificity of her answer took him aback. She wasn't guessing, she knew. "You read The Lancet?" he asked, unable to keep the incredulity from his tone. "For leisure?" A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips for a fraction of a second. "I have trouble sleeping sometimes, Doctor, and I like to understand the why behind what we do here. It helps me be a better nurse, to anticipate, to understand what my patients are going through on a physiological level." He just stared at her, the gears in his brilliant mind turning furiously, trying to process this new information. This wasn't just a cog in the machine. This was a mind, a sharp and inquisitive one, hidden behind a plain blue uniform and a quiet demeanor. He had no response. He had come for a simple answer and found a complex equation. So, as abruptly as he had arrived, he turned and walked out, leaving her alone with her cold tea and the lingering intensity of his presence. But as he walked away, the look in his eyes had changed. The arrogance had been pierced by a sliver of something that felt unnervingly like respect. From that night on, Julian Croft began to see Ilara Vance. It was as if a filter had been removed from his vision. The invisible nurse, the quiet one, had suddenly become sharply, undeniably visible, a constant and intriguing presence on his radar. He started to watch her, not with the detached gaze of a superior, but with the focused attention of a scientist who has just discovered a fascinating new phenomenon. In the corridors, during shift changes, in the rare moments of quiet, his eyes sought her out, analyzing her gestures, her interactions, the way she moved through the world. And what he saw, day after day, only deepened his bewilderment and a strange, burgeoning admiration. He saw her from a distance, patiently explaining a complex medication schedule to an elderly man's anxious daughter, using simple, clear language, her voice a low murmur of reassurance that calmed the woman's tears. He witnessed her gently but firmly holding the hand of a terminal patient, a lonely old man with no family left, reading to him from a worn paperback of Dylan Thomas's poetry until his ragged breathing softened into peaceful sleep. He watched as she noticed a patient shivering, and without being asked, found a warm blanket and tucked it carefully around him, a small act of profound compassion that no one else had bothered to perform. She was the antithesis of everything he knew in his world, of fierce competition, inflated egos, and professional detachment. And this realization both disarmed and fascinated him in equal measure. The detail that finally shattered the last layer of his icy armor, the moment that made him realize this was something far deeper than mere professional admiration, occurred on a particularly grim night. He was leaving the hospital after another grueling, soul-crushing surgery, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. As he walked down the corridor leading to the small, rarely used hospital chapel, he saw her. Ilara was sitting in the last pew, her back to the door, her shoulders shaking with soft, silent sobs. His first instinct was to turn and walk away, to respect her privacy, to not get involved. It was the Croft way. But a stronger impulse, a genuine and inexplicable current of concern, made him stop. He entered the chapel, his expensive leather shoes echoing softly in the hallowed silence. He approached her slowly. "Nurse Vance," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He assumed she was mourning a patient they had lost. "Is everything all right?" She started, startled by his presence, and quickly wiped at her tears with the back of her hands, like a child caught doing something wrong. "Dr. Croft," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm fine. We lost Mr. Abernathy in bed 12. he stated, trying to offer a logical reason for her grief. He fought hard. It's acceptable to be upset. She shook her head, looking up at him with eyes that were raw with an empathy he couldn't comprehend. No, Doctor. It's not just Mr. Abernathy, it's all of them. She took a shaky breath. Sometimes the pain of others, the fear, the loneliness, it all builds up in here, she said, gesturing to her own chest. And if you don't let it out, it drowns you. I needed to cry for a moment for someone who isn't me. Her answer, so simple, so profound, struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a revelation. This woman wasn't crying for herself, for her own undoubtedly difficult life. She was crying for others. She was a vessel for their pain, and sometimes the vessel overflowed. In that instant, standing in the quiet sanctity of the chapel, he felt an overwhelming wave of admiration and a tenderness so powerful it frightened him. The following day, a small, silent gesture marked the beginning of a new chapter in their unlikely relationship. When Ilara arrived for her night shift, she found something on top of her locker in the changing room. It was a proper ceramic mug, not a paper cup, filled with hot, strong black coffee, just the way she liked it. Beside it was a small, folded note, written in an elegant, sharp handwriting she immediately recognized as Dr. Croft's. The note contained a single, short sentence, yet it was laden with a meaning that made her heart skip a beat for someone who gives too much and receives very little. Thank you, JC. She quickly glanced around to make sure no one was watching, and then a smile, a genuine, spontaneous smile that was not for a patient, not for a colleague, but just for herself, illuminated her tired face. It was the first time someone in this hospital had truly seen her, had acknowledged her silent giving. And the fact that this recognition came from the most feared and inaccessible man in the entire institution made the gesture all the more potent and meaningful. That simple mug of coffee became a symbol of hope, proof that perhaps, even in the coldest, darkest places, kindness could still find a way to bloom. Their interactions, once rare and strictly professional, began to change. Julian, now openly intrigued by the woman behind the uniform, started seeking her out in moments of calm, in the quiet of the early morning hours. And his questions were no longer about surgical maneuvers or medical journals. They were about her. During one such conversation, as they shared a comfortable silence in the now familiar staff room, he finally asked the question that had been puzzling him from the beginning. "Why, Ilara?" he asked, using her first name for the first time, the sound of it feeling both strange and right on his tongue. "Why a woman with your intelligence, your observational skills, your clear passion for knowledge? Why didn't you study medicine? You could be a brilliant doctor." She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to share the philosophy that guided her life. Then, with the disarming simplicity that so captivated him, she answered, "Because caring is also a way of saving, Doctor," she said softly. "Sometimes a word of comfort, a hand to hold, an ear that truly listens, that can save a soul from the abyss of despair. Medicine cures the body, and that is a noble and necessary thing. But true care, the kind I try to give, can sometimes help to heal the soul. And from a very young age, I felt my calling was to heal souls." Her answer once again left him speechless. It forced him to reevaluate his own rigid definitions of what it meant to be a doctor, of what it truly meant to save a life. He had spent his entire career mending the complex machinery of the human body, but he had never once stopped to consider the ghost in the machine, the soul. And this quiet nurse, with her worn-out shoes and her infinite capacity for empathy, understood it better than he ever could. The professional boundary that had separated them was irrevocably breached on a night when Julian, feeling a desperate, suffocating need to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital and the profound loneliness of his immaculate flat, made an impulsive decision. He waited for Ilara at the staff exit at the end of her shift, standing awkwardly near the rain-slicked pavement as the city's evening traffic rumbled past. "Ilara, wait!" he called out, his voice slightly louder than usual, betraying his nervousness. She stopped, turning to him with a questioning look, clutching her worn coat tighter against the damp chill. "I know this is unorthodox," he began, his usual clipped confidence replaced by a rare hesitation. "And please, don't misunderstand my intention. I don't wish to make you uncomfortable, but I would like to thank you properly for my patient and for, well, for everything." He took a shallow breath. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner? Somewhere quiet, away from all of this?" She stared at him, surprised and wary. Dinner with Dr. Croft. The idea was as absurd as it was tempting. A cautious, wounded part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain the safe distance that had always protected her. But another part, a curious and perhaps lonely part, felt compelled to say yes. And so, she did. The dinner took place in a small, charming restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of Notting Hill, a place with only a dozen tables, soft candlelight, and an intimate atmosphere. She wore the only truly nice dress she owned, a simple, elegant navy blue sheath. To her surprise, he arrived not in a suit, but in a soft linen shirt and dark jeans, making him look younger, more accessible, and somehow more human. For the first time, stripped of the armor of his authority and the shield of his arrogance, he allowed himself to be vulnerable. Over plates of exquisite food and glasses of good wine, Julian and Ilara finally saw each other for who they truly were. Two solitary souls, each carrying their own heavy burden of pain and grief. He, for the first time, spoke openly about the death of his wife, Eleanor, 5 years prior. He recounted the story of the surgery he himself had led, an operation that should have been straightforward but was complicated by a rare, unforeseeable aneurysm. His voice was low, devoid of its usual clinical detachment, filled instead with a raw, lingering pain. "I was the lead surgeon, Ilara," he said, staring into his wineglass as if it held the past. "My hands, they could perform the most complex procedures on strangers, fix hearts that were all but destroyed, but I couldn't save her." He finally looked up, and the guilt in his eyes was so profound it made her ache. "After that day, I built a wall. I decided that feeling anything, love, hope, was a liability I couldn't afford. It hurts too much, you see, and I don't believe in second chances, not for me." His confession, so raw and laden with a grief that was still bleeding, moved Ilara deeply. Instead of offering him empty platitudes or pity, she looked at him with her wise, serene eyes and offered a perspective he had never considered. "The pain doesn't kill you, Julian," she said softly, but with an unshakable certainty. "The emptiness does. The pain is just a scar that reminds you that you were lucky enough to have something, someone worth hurting for. The loneliness, that's what convinces you that you're already dead." The wisdom in her simple words struck him like a bolt of lightning, illuminating a dark corner of his soul he had kept locked away for years. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he didn't feel judged or pitied. He felt understood. From that transformative dinner forward, their relationship entered new territory, one of growing tenderness and complicity. The small gestures became more frequent, more meaningful. He began to call her Ilara, not just in private, but in front of colleagues, a subtle but powerful signal that she was no longer anonymous to him. He would leave a single, perfect gardenia on her locker. It sent a quiet greeting at the start of her shift. He found creative, almost boyish, pretexts to see her, to talk for just a few minutes amidst their hectic schedules. "Dr. Vance," he'd say with a hint of a smile, catching her in the hallway, "I require your expert opinion on the chart for the patient in room 3. And she, with a playful glint in her eyes, would reply, "Of course, Dr. Croft, but my consultation fee is 1 strong black coffee." They would share a laugh, a quiet, secret code in the serious world of the hospital. The first kiss, the definitive step that would seal. The transition from deep friendship to the beginning of love happened on a particularly grueling night after a 12-hour shift that had left them both physically and emotionally drained. He walked with her to a small, forgotten rooftop terrace on the oldest wing of the hospital, a place that offered a spectacular view of the sleeping city, the Shard piercing the starry sky. The cool night air seemed to cleanse their minds and calm their tired hearts. They stood in silence for a long time, side by side, watching the distant lights, feeling the peace of the shared moment. It was then that he turned to her, his heart hammering against his ribs, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the city. The vulnerability in his eyes was so palpable, it took her breath away. "May I?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. The simple question was freighted with a universe of meaning, of fears and hopes. He wasn't just asking for a kiss. He was asking for permission to enter her world, to try, together, to heal. She didn't answer with words. She simply closed the small distance between them, her eyes fluttering shut in a gesture of pure trust and surrender. The kiss that followed was tender, restrained, almost reverent. It wasn't a kiss of sweeping passion, but one of silent promise. It was a kiss that said, without words, that they were finally ready to begin again. However, in an environment as enclosed and prone to gossip as St. Jude's, the news of the deepening involvement between the head of surgery and the quiet night nurse soon became the main topic of conversation, generating a wave of envy, prejudice, and disapproval. The hospital board, pressured by more conservative members and worried about the institution's image and ethics, decided to take exemplary action. "Dr. Croft," said Sir Alan Carmichael, the hospital's director, in a cold, formal meeting to which Julian had been summoned alone, "your relationship with a nurse on your staff compromises professional ethics and the established hierarchy of this hospital. It is an unacceptable situation that we cannot tolerate." The threat was clear. Either he ended the relationship or he would face suspension and the potential loss of his position as department head. When Julian told Ilara about the meeting, her first reaction was one of self-sacrifice. "Julian, no. Please don't fight this. I'll leave. I'll resign," she said, her eyes filling with tears, her heart aching with the injustice of it all. "I won't be a problem for you. I won't let them destroy your career because of me." But he held her shoulders firmly, his eyes blazing with a determination she had never seen before. "You are not a problem, Ilara. You are the only solution I have found in my entire life. And I will not give up on you, not without a fight." And fight is exactly what Julian Croft did. He not only refused to comply with the director's order, but he escalated the matter himself, demanding a full meeting with the hospital's executive board. In front of those powerful, influential men and women, he defended his love for Ilara with an eloquence and passion that no one would have expected from the cold, calculating surgeon. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his voice resonating with conviction, "I am prepared to resign from my position, to give up my career, everything I have built in this hospital, if it means I must hide or deny the woman I love, because she, with her kindness, her intelligence, and her boundless compassion, has made me a better doctor and a far better man. If this hospital has no room for that kind of love, for that kind of humanity, then this hospital does not deserve me." But the most moving turn of events was yet to come. While the meeting was underway, a spontaneous movement of support for Ilara had begun to ripple through the hospital. Patients, former patients, and entire families who had been touched by her compassion started to make their voices heard. An open letter signed by dozens of people was delivered to the director's office, detailing Ilara's countless acts of kindness, defending her character, and demanding that she not be punished for loving and being loved. The hospital, faced with the unyielding pressure from its star surgeon, and more importantly, the heartfelt testimony of its own patients, had no choice but to retreat. The archaic rule was reviewed, and Ilara, for the first time in her life, was publicly recognized, not for a surgical maneuver she suggested, but for the immeasurable value of her care and her humanity. Years after that battle was won, St. Jude's Royal Infirmary was a different place. Isabella Castillo, with Julian's unwavering support, had finally fulfilled her own potential. She had graduated from medical school with honors, specializing in palliative care, and now led an innovative program for humanizing patient care at the hospital, a program that became a model for the entire country. Julian, for his part, remained the brilliant surgeon he always was, but the ice in his veins had melted for good. He now smiled, he offered thanks, he called his junior doctors by their first names, and he taught his students that medicine without compassion is merely an empty science. He and Ilara had married in an intimate, emotional ceremony and now had 2 children, a son with his father's intense, intelligent eyes, and a daughter with her mother's sweet smile and generous heart. The final scene of this journey of healing and love takes place on a late afternoon in the same quiet hospital chapel where, years before, Julian had found her crying alone. They were not there for a death, but to celebrate life. Hand in hand, in a companionable and serene silence, they renewed, in their own way, the unspoken vows of love and gratitude that bound them together. "Sometimes, my love," she whispered, her head resting on his shoulder, "all it takes is for one person to truly see you, to recognize the value of your soul, for you to start living again." And he, kissing the top of her head, his voice thick with emotion, replied, "And you, my dearest Dr. Vance, my angel. You saw me when I didn't even know I was still alive. You saved me, Ilara. In every single way a person can be saved.